Transportation is just everywhere in a supply chain. Companies naturally assume they understand it. But a lot of organizations manage freight by just picking up the phone and calling a carrier for a quote. That is purely reactive purchasing. We call this emotional negotiation. Labeling freight with subjective words like expensive or cheap without actually understanding the underlying structure. What we really want is parametrized negotiation, where freight stops being this subjective opinion and becomes a measurable, operational, and mathematical model. To really test your organization, pose this critical question to your team. What is the real economic difference between a 200-kilometer route and a 400-kilometer route? It sounds super basic, right? But most organizations simply cannot answer it correctly because they lack the structural visibility. Every single kilometer creates cost, and ignoring this operational math is honestly like writing a blank check to your carriers. Moving on to Section 2, the hidden cost structure, looking at the anatomy of a truck. A freight rate is never just a random number pulled out of thin air by a carrier. It's built from highly tangible operational components. First, you've got direct costs, the things you can physically see being consumed out on the road, like fuel, driver wages, and maintenance. Then, layered on top of that are the indirect costs, your dispatch operations, insurance, administrative overhead. And finally, the profit margin. Deconstructing these elements brilliantly demystifies the rate completely and proves that pricing is always rooted in logic, never just guesswork. And here is a universal truth you absolutely must take away from this. Whether you are operating in Brazil's highly regulated ANTT market, the completely free market US, or a deregulated Europe, the baseline operational economics simply do not change. At the end of the day, a truck consumes fuel, labor, maintenance, and capital. There is universally a minimum sustainable operational cost. Turning a blind eye to this reality is exactly how companies end up building deeply unstable logistics networks. Let's look at Section 3, the mathematics of utilization, and finding those hidden margin leaks. One of the biggest sourcing mistakes you can make is assuming all freight behaves equally. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But of all the variables out there, utilization is absolute king. Just think about this. An empty truck returning home is one of the largest hidden inefficiencies in logistics. It's literally the equivalent of paying a taxi to just drive around the block all day long with no passengers in the back seat. The operational costs, the fuel, the driver's time, those persist, but your revenue completely drops to zero. This backhaul inefficiency is a silent killer of profit margins. True management isn't just negotiating a rate, it is intelligent network design. That naturally leads us into Section 4, strategic negotiation in practice, building the benchmark. We need to shift from just talking theory to a real practical model. Imagine a standard 3-axle drive van running 120,000 miles annually. Let's say your mathematical modeling establishes a baseline benchmark of $300 per 100 kilometers. This changes the entire game. A 300-kilometer route follows one clear economic logic, and a 500-kilometer route follows another. Transportation is no longer just someone's opinion. It's cold, hard math. Armed with that benchmark, your entire negotiation strategy completely evolves. Instead of emotionally reacting and just saying, "Oh, this carrier is too expensive," you elevate the conversation. You start asking precise operational questions. Is there heavy toll exposure on this specific lane? Are we suffering from poor backhaul utilization? Wait, is our own warehouse causing excessive waiting time? This mathematical framework elevates your procurement teams from just arguing over pennies to communicating with real, professional operational intelligence. And honestly, here is the real secret. True, sustainable savings rarely come from just squeezing your carriers for lower and lower prices. I mean, you can't force them to skip maintenance or somehow magically eliminate fuel consumption, right? Real optimization happens inside your own system. It happens when you reduce dock waiting times, when you improve your route design, and when you maximize those backhauls. A stopped truck is incredibly expensive. Improving your internal intelligence is the actual key to driving external costs down. Finally, Section 5, freight as a financial lever, impacting the bottom line. This is probably the most critical insight for any executive, linking transportation directly to product profitability. Look at this figure here, 2.4%. Imagine you're transporting 1,000 units, valued at $50,000, across a 400-kilometer route. If your parameterized cost is $1,200, freight is exactly 2.4% of that product's value. When transportation becomes mathematically visible like this, your entire supply chain suddenly becomes controllable, and as a result, your profitability skyrockets. There's just a massive contrast between merely surviving day to day and achieving true strategic dominance. Under reactive sourcing, you're perpetually putting out fires, chasing isolated freight discounts, trying to force lower prices, and suffering from super fragmented decisions. But strategic logistics design, that is where you engineer true transportation economics. You leverage scale-based negotiation, you demand higher load density, and you implement rigorous network planning. This is what strategic logistics actually looks like in the real world. This entire transformation, from emotional guessing to mathematical mastery, it requires a solid structural framework. Methodologies like supply axis provide the exact vital ecosystem you need to gain that deep visibility. The companies that are absolutely dominating modern logistics today, they don't just buy freight. No, they engineer their transportation economics. They understand cost per kilometer, route utilization, and operational proportionality inside and out. It is, without a doubt, the ultimate competitive advantage for the modern supply chain. I want to leave you with one provocative thought to take back to your teams today. Are you simply buying freight, or are you truly ready to mathematically engineer your transportation economics? The financial impact of how you answer that question will absolutely define your supply chain's future.